Hi, I'm Jeff Kildea and this is Croppies Downunder, a series of vodcasts that looks at some of the more arcane aspects of the history of the Irish in Australia. In this episode, we will look back to 1920 and the expulsion from the Australian Federal Parliament of Hugh Mahon, the Irish-born Labor member for the seat of Kalgoorlie. For Australians, the 11th of November is a date that resonates in our nation's history. On that date in 1880, Ned Kelly was hanged. In 1918, it saw the end of the fighting on the Western Front. And in 1975, it was the day on which Governor-General Sir John Kerr dismissed the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. Less well known is another momentous 11th of November, a day unique in Australian political history. On that day in 1920, Prime Minister Billy Hughes moved a motion for the expulsion from the Federal Parliament of the Labor member for Kalgoorlie, Hugh Mahon, because of his public criticism of British rule in Ireland. At that time, the Irish were engaged in a bitter war against the British to gain their independence. Hughes charged that Mahon was unfit to remain a member of the House because of seditious and disloyal utterances he had made that were inconsistent with his oath of allegiance. The furor arose from a speech Mahon had made at a public meeting in Melbourne's Richmond Reserve on the 7th of November 1920 to protest the death of Irish hunger striker Terence McSweeney, the Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Cork. According to a report the next morning in the Argus, Mahon had told the crowd of more than 3,000 people, "Never in Russia, under the worst rule of the Tsars, had there been such an infamous murder as that of the late Alderman McSweeney. They were told in the papers that Alderman McSweeney's poor widow sobbed over his coffin. If there was a just God in heaven, that sob would reach round the world and one day would shake the foundations of this bloody and accursed empire." Mahon's speech was made just 4 days before the second anniversary of the armistice that brought an end to the war in which 60,000 Australians had died fighting for this bloody and accursed empire. Public reaction was swift and brutal. Protestant, loyalist and ex-service organisations flooded the government with telegrams, letters and personal representations demanding Mahon's removal from Parliament. Newspaper editorials followed suit. The Argus declared, "By his statements, Mr. Mahon had done treason to Australia and had insulted and humiliated the overwhelming bulk of his fellow citizens." The Sydney Morning Herald complained that Mahon had uttered the most vulgar diatribes on the empire of which this country is a part. The Age agreed, arguing, "The government will be compelled to take further action, and in doing so, it will merit approval." Hughes readily obliged by moving Mahon's expulsion. Let me paint the picture. It was just after 2:40 on the afternoon of Thursday, the 11th of November 1920, when Prime Minister Billy Hughes approached the dispatch box of the House of Representatives in the Parliament building in Melbourne. He cast his eyes round the galleries, high above the chamber. They were filled to overflowing. Outside in Spring Street at the top of Burke Street, it was a mild spring day, cloudy but dry. Inside, however, the atmosphere was stormy and electric. The public and the pressmen, tightly squeezed into their respective galleries, fell silent in expectation. Like spectators at the Roman Colosseum, they had come to witness an execution, albeit a political one. They would not be disappointed. In his high-pitched, nasally voice, Hughes read from the piece of paper he held in his hand. I move that in the opinion of this House, the Honourable Member for Kalgoorlie, the Honourable Hugh Mahon, having by seditious and disloyal utterances at a public meeting on Sunday last, been guilty of conduct unfitting him to remain a member of this House and inconsistent with the oath of allegiance which he has taken as a member of this House, be expelled this House. For the next 14 hours, interrupted only by breaks for dinner and a midnight snack, the House debated Hugh's motion and a Labor amendment that would have disavowed the Parliament's right to try Hugh Mahon. Then, as the dawn glow began to appear in the eastern sky, the Treasurer, Sir Joseph Cook, rose and, interrupting Labor's Frank Anstey, who was in full rhetorical flight, moved the closure of the debate. The members of the House divided, and voting along party lines 34-17, Labor's amendment was defeated and Hugh's motion passed. For the first and only time, a member of the House of Representatives had been expelled from the Commonwealth Parliament. Mahon was not in the chamber to see it. He had refused to come to the Parliament to defend himself. Nevertheless, as depicted by a cartoon in the Australian Worker, the House had delivered Mahon's head to Salome Hughes. Now, putting aside the melodrama and the political theatre, so obviously an element of this unique event in the political history of the Australian Commonwealth, Mahon's expulsion is rightly regarded today as an injustice, or, in the words of the 1984 report of the Joint Select Committee on Parliamentary Privilege, an abuse of power by a partisan vote. In this talk, I want to do the following. First, relate briefly Mahon's life and career up to his expulsion. Second, describe the context in which Mahon made his Richmond speech. And third, explain why I say that Mahon's expulsion is rightly regarded today as an injustice. Hugh Mahon was born in 1857 at Kalgoorlie in Kings County, which is now County Offaly. The family moved to North America in 1869, but returned in 1880 after their American dream had failed. While in America, Mahon had learned the newspaper business, and on returning to Ireland, he worked as a journalist at New Ross in County Wexford. He also became an activist with the Land League, using his press to print leaflets advocating the boycott of landlords. As a result, he was arrested in October 1881 and imprisoned in Kilmainham jail with Charles Stewart Parnell. Having been released in January 1882 on health grounds and warned that he would be rearrested if he returned to his political activities, Mahon left for Australia in April 1882. After arriving in Melbourne, Mahon travelled extensively in Victoria and New South Wales, promoting the newly established Irish National League. He also helped organise the 1883 fundraising tour of Irish Home Rule advocates John and William Redmond before returning to journalism. Thereafter, Mahon pursued his career as a reporter, editor, and newspaper owner in Goulburn, Sydney, Gosford, and Melbourne before heading to Western Australia in 1894, following the discovery of gold at Coolgardie. There, he was associated with a number of newspapers, including the Menzies Miner and the Kalgoorlie Sun, earning a reputation as a crusading newspaper man, exposing corruption in government and in business. At the elections for the first Commonwealth Parliament in May 1901, Mahon successfully stood as the Labor candidate in the seat of Coolgardie. Mahon served in Parliament for almost 20 years, as a backbencher and as a minister in 4 Labor administrations, rising to Minister for External Affairs in the First World War. During this time, Mahon gained a reputation as one of the brainiest men in Parliament, as well as one of the most controversial. In 1916, he made the decision to oppose Hughes's plans for conscription and remained with the Labor Party after its split. He lost his seat in the Khaki election of 1917, but regained it in 1919. No longer a minister, Mahon had more time to devote to promoting Irish self-government. Originally a supporter of Home Rule and the Irish Parliamentary Party, Mahon, like many Australian Catholics of Irish descent, became radicalised by events in Ireland following the 1916 Easter Rising, transforming into a supporter of Sinn Féin. In 1919, he was elected president of the pro-independence Irish Island League of Victoria, and it was this league which organised the meeting at the Richmond Reserve. Next, we'll have a look at the context of Mahon's Richmond speech. Sectarianism between Catholics, mostly of Irish descent, and Protestants, mostly of British descent, had been endemic in Australia since the founding of the colony at Sydney in 1788. Nevertheless, for the most part, Catholics and Protestants coexisted peacefully, but occasionally there would be a flare-up, sometimes around the 12th of July, as in Melbourne in 1846, when shots were fired, or on St. Patrick's Day, as in Sydney in 1878, when rioting broke out. In the years immediately before the First World War, tensions began to rise when Catholics began a political campaign for government funding of their schools. This was coupled with intense local interest in the debate over the Asquith government's intention to legislate for Irish Home Rule. The outbreak of war acted as a circuit breaker, with Catholics and Protestants coming together in the recruiting halls to enlist in the Australian Imperial Force. For the next 20 months, until April 1916, the fragile truce remained in place. But, as in Ireland, all changed utterly following the Easter Rising. After the execution of the rebel leaders, Australian Catholics of Irish descent began openly to criticise British rule in Ireland, prompting a Protestant backlash. The situation worsened when Prime Minister Billy Hughes sought to introduce conscription. He knew that his Labor colleagues would not agree to it, so he went over their heads to the people with a referendum. The ploy failed, as the Australian people in October 1916 rejected conscription. A second referendum in December 1917 also failed. Hughes and other pro-conscriptionists laid the blame on Australia's Irish Catholics. Hughes split with the Labor Party and joined forces with the Conservative Liberal Party to form a new coalition that became known as the Win the War Party, and then the Nationalist Party. After the armistice ended the War of the Nations, the sectarian war in Australia continued, fanned by events in Ireland and locally. During the Irish War of Independence that began in January 1919, press reports of atrocities were seized upon by sectarian warriors on one side or the other to berate their opponents. The situation in Ireland deteriorated in 1920 following the introduction of the Black and Tans and the burning of whole towns as reprisals. The worsening situation in Ireland, combined with a series of local events, led to what the New South Wales Attorney General Edward McTiernan described as a veritable hurricane of sectarian strife. And it was in this context that Mahon addressed the meeting at Richmond Reserve. Next, let's have a look at why I say Hugh Mahon's expulsion was unjust. 100 years on, it is difficult to see how Mahon's speech justified his expulsion. The words allegedly used by Mahon seem no more shocking than what one might expect in the everyday cut and thrust of political debate. But in making a judgment about events in the past, we must always be careful to avoid viewing those events through the lens of attitudes prevailing today. We must take account of the context of the times. When Mahon gave his speech, the second anniversary of the armistice was just days away, and the sacrifices of the nation in aid of the empire were uppermost in many people's minds, particularly those who had lost loved ones. Furthermore, most Australians then believed their national security depended on the continued strength and dominance of the British Empire. For many Australians in 1920, the most immediate threat to the empire came from an independent Ireland that would leave Britain vulnerable to an enemy attack on its western flank. Yet, even taking into account the sentiments of the times, it is my contention that Mahon's expulsion was unjustifiable, a miscarriage of justice carried out for party political purposes and as an act of revenge by a vindictive Billy Hughes. And let me explain what I mean. As we know, Mahon's so-called trial by his parliamentary colleagues began on the afternoon of the 11th of November 1920. Yet, 2 days before, the Cabinet had resolved that Mahon should be expelled. And on the 10th of November, the Nationalist Party caucus unanimously agreed to that course unless Mahon was prepared to disavow entirely the sentiments expressed in his speech at Richmond. Country Party members also unanimously agreed. Thus, even before Mahon's trial began, the jurors on the government benches had determined his guilt and his punishment, which could only be avoided if he were to confess and recant. Furthermore, the government's case was based on hearsay, the report in the Argus. No witnesses were called to testify to what Mahon had said, not even the Argus reporter. And when Labor's Frank Anstey tried to move an amendment to require witnesses to be brought before the House, the government gagged the debate. The report in the Argus was patently deficient as a means of ascertaining what Mahon had said. It contained a short 200-word summary of Mahon's speech. Articles in the Advocate and the Tribune used 1,250 words to report that same speech. Their accounts differed in significant respects from the report in the Argus, as did the short report appearing in the Age. The government did not even attempt to establish as a matter of law that Mahon's alleged words constituted seditious and disloyal utterances. Instead, government speakers used rhetoric rather than legal analysis to make their case, loading Mahon's words with all the fears, anxieties, and indignation of an insecure and grieving nation riven by sectarianism. If the government had believed that Mahon's words constituted seditious and disloyal utterances, it could have prosecuted him under the War Precautions Act, which still applied in 1920. That was the action it took against another Labor member, Mick Considine, who was prosecuted in July 1919 for saying in public, "Bugger the king, he is a bloody German bastard." Although Considine was convicted and sentenced to 3 weeks' imprisonment, Hughes did not seek his expulsion. In Mahon's case, a prosecution would have meant delay and an uncertain result. One government MP admitted during the debate that a conviction would be difficult to obtain. But a vote in the House allowed Hughes to control the process and the outcome. And being quick, a by-election could be held within weeks when public opinion was still seething, thus maximising the chance of winning Mahon's seat. And Hughes was desperate to pick up an extra seat. After the December 1919 elections, Hughes's Nationalist Party was 1 seat short of a majority. Unlike when Considine was convicted, Hughes now depended on the support of members of the newly formed Country Party, who, though anti-Labor, did not always vote with the government. There had recently been a couple of close shaves in the House when Country Party members had voted against it. The capture of Mahon's seat at the resulting by-election would give Hughes the majority he needed to secure his survival. A further consideration is Hughes's deep personal animus against Mahon. Once friends, they had fallen out over Mahon's failure to support Hughes during the conscription campaign of 1916. Hughes had expected Mahon to help him persuade Australian Catholics of Irish descent to support conscription. However, Mahon, though not in principle opposed to conscription, was unconvinced that it was needed at that time and feared it would lead to civil disorder. Not wishing to undermine Hughes by saying so, he kept a low profile during the campaign, neither supporting nor opposing a yes vote. But in the last week of the campaign, Mahon was flushed out when a newspaper erroneously reported he would be addressing a pro-conscription rally at Kalgoorlie. In denying the story, Mahon said he had never made a public utterance in favour of conscription. Hughes responded by claiming that in the ministry, Mahon was a wholehearted supporter of conscription and that he had supported the policy of the government with voice and vote in the cabinet. Mahon rejected that claim, saying, "I have not supported and am not supporting conscription publicly or privately, directly or indirectly." 2 weeks after the referendum was defeated, Hughes walked out of the caucus. Mahon, who had lost respect for his erstwhile friend because of his erratic, cynical and dictatorial behaviour during the campaign, refused to follow him. Hughes's deep resentment of what he perceived as Mahon's double betrayal was on show during the 1917 and 1919 election campaigns, when Hughes launched bitter attacks against Mahon. Mahon's impulsive Richmond speech gave Hughes a not-to-be-missed opportunity to exact revenge. Mahon chose not to attend the House to defend himself, telling his leader, Frank Tudor, "I wish by my absence to show my scorn and contempt for the whole servile crew." Mahon well knew it would be futile to seek to persuade the government members of his innocence, writing to Hughes, "If one spoke with the tongue of an angel, he would not alter in 1 iota their clandestine decree." Mahon believed his best chance was to appeal to his constituents. However, in that belief, he was mistaken. In a by-election fought on empire loyalty grounds, he was narrowly defeated. It is the only occasion on which an opposition seat has been lost to the government in a federal by-election. Out of Parliament, but not out of a job, Mahon continued to run his business interests. He was managing director of the Catholic Church Property Insurance Company, which he had formed in 1911 at the request of the Catholic bishops. In 1922, he made his first and only visit to Ireland since his exile 40 years before. Mahon died at his home in Melbourne in 1931 and is buried at Box Hill Cemetery. So there we have it. Mahon's expulsion is just one example of how events in Ireland in the 19th and early 20th century had a significant impact in Australia. In future episodes, we will examine some more. Until next time, fare thee well.